Good morning to all of you. It's my privilege to introduce a great scholar of our country, Fulbright Fellow, none other than Professor Kalidas Misra. Sir, we welcome you, sir, on behalf of National Translation Mission and also Rama Devi Women's University for this program. And Professor Kalidas Misra is from Sambalpur University, Dept of English. He has worked with American universities for his Fulbright Fellowship, and also he received Best Thesis Award from American Studies Research Center, Hyderabad. His doctoral thesis, The War Novel in America, a study of changing response. And also he worked with German projects. His publications are received much attention from the readers, especially researchers and scholars of the various countries. The poems and articles appeared in most prestigious journals like Indian Literature, New Quest, Chandrabhaga, Skylark, Ojas, Vanajotsana, Four Quarters of Philadelphia, and Indian Journal of American Studies, Journal of Contemporary Thought. Sir, with this brief, we welcome you, sir, for our literary tour to have buffet with you on various aspects of literary translation. We welcome you, sir.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction. Let me begin. I am very much thankful to National Translation Mission and to all the organizers there for inviting me to this program. And my talk will be on aspects of literary translation. And I begin my presentation with a quote from the preface to the King James Bible, 1611. You know, when King James Bible was published, it was the result of so many translators. Earlier, for translating the Bible, translators had gone to the gallows. But when the preface was, when the King James version was published, there was this wonderful preface where the translators have written, translation, it is that opens the window to let in the light, that breaks the cell, that we may eat the kernel, that puts aside the curtain, that we may look into the most holy place. And it goes on. Translation is like opening windows. It is like having a breath of fresh air. Or it is very much like having some sort of a connection with the world outside, the world that we never know. So we carry on like that. And added to that, there is another quote which I have taken from Rabindranath Tagore's letter to Mr. Ajit Kumar Chakrabarti on 13th March. Tagore wrote a letter to Ajit Kumar Chakrabarti on 13th March 1913 about translating his poems into English. Next slide, please. And what Tagore was writing, that translation is like a bride. It is almost like the bride's reception at her husband's home. It is almost like the bride's reception at her husband's home after the wedding is over. The bride must make friends with the community to which she must belong. Henceforth, When I wrote originally in Bangla, it was merely a poet's wedding with the muse. It was merely a poet's wedding with the muse. Only after the assembly, so that is, but the bride must meet and must make friends with the community to which she must belong. Only after the assembled guests partake joyfully of the feast from the bride's hand, her union with the husband receives the society's sanction. So, translated text is like a bride, and the original, creation that Tagore had at that time, he was only wedded to the muse. Only after translating it, as if the bride is coming to the groom's place and trying to acclimatize herself with the new situation and trying to please. So that is quite interesting. This Tagore's view on translation. But nowadays, because we are talking so much about world literature, the renewed and rapidly growing interest in world literature as such has inevitably entailed a reconsideration of translation as literature's key mode of circulation. We don't know what is happening around in other countries in the literature, what is being written elsewhere. So when we are talking about translation, we are talking about a space where new things are being written and new things are coming to light with the help of translation. New works of art are being translated, brought to light. But where my presentation is on literary translation, and it is the translation of poetry, plays, novels, short stories, as well as songs, rhymes, and literary and critical articles. Non-literary translation is different, which focuses on facts and makes an accurate and straightforward literal description of the objective fact, whereas literary translation emphasizes the transfer of value and art, and a literary translator always tries to rewrite the text and reproduce a non-literal rendition of the original text. And for this, the translator's understanding of the source language text and its creative reconstruction of the target language text is very much essential. So you must understand the source language text, and you also must know very much the target language text so that communication is possible. Literal translation is very much different because it is a term used to describe a word-for-word translation that sticks too close to the source text. It is a translation that sounds unnatural in the target language and is usually hard to read and doesn't convey the meaning of the original text. Like, for example, we have to take a decision. We have different types of translation: literary translation, professional translation, technical translation, administrative translation. So when you are talking about that, you are not talking about just an accurate transcription of words from one language to other. It carries with it a strong sense of belonging, changing, transforming, or altering one thing into another, bringing a strange dynamic which involves interpretation, invention, and fidelity to the original. Very difficult thing. For example, I'll just give an example. When you are talking about T.S. Eliot's, first line from the Westland, April is the cruelest month. How you are going to translate this into another language? Maybe Odia, maybe Bangla, or something else. If you are giving emphasis to the source language, April is the season of spring. But April in a tropical country like India, may not be able to convey what Eliot wanted to say. So the translator, very much walks the razor edge, and it is up to him to decide how to, involve himself in translation that will be bringing in words which are very much different from the target language. So there is interpretation, invention, fidelity to the original text. And the translation process that way involves exploration of a constellation of linguistic, cultural, ideological, and cohesive relations that make up the fabric of a text, involving a framework of context, culture, cognition. You must know the context, you must know the culture, you must know the cognition, all these together. That is very much, to be reminded. The extensive differences between the audience of a source text and the destination text, cutting across time, space, and culture, determine the variations in translation. The extensive difference between the audience of a source text and the destination text, the source language and the target language, for whom you are translating. Who is your target audience? Is there any difference in culture? Is there any difference in culture-specific words which need to be, carefully translated? Whether it is possible to translate certain culture-specific words, all these things are to be taken into account when you are trying to give, a set of rendering from one text to other, from the source text to the other text. Translation that way, various critics have commented on that. They say it is rewriting of an original text, some say. And all rewritings, whatever their intention, reflect a certain ideology and poetics, and as such, manipulate literature to function in a given society in a given way. You rewrite. You don't exactly, render it in a sort of word for word format. You rewrite taking into account the target audience, taking into account the culture, the place, because when you are talking about language, language comes to us with a distinctly different guise. When you are talking about the nuance, when you are talking about the rhythm, the music, and the connotative, the associative memory of words. So it is very much, different. And this is what, in a letter written to August Skigel on July 23rd, 1796, William Humboldt, the scholar, translator, the great, literary personality, states explicitly, I believe that all translation is an attempt to complete a task that cannot be completed. All translators end up stumbling on one of the two stumbling blocks, either by adhering too closely to the original text and thereby sacrificing the language and style of their own culture, or by adhering too closely to the conventions of their own culture and sacrificing the original. So you have to walk the razor's edge. Should we, adhere too close to the original text, or should we also put emphasis on the target language audience? There should be a proper balance, and maintaining a balance between the source language and the target language becomes a very difficult exercise. The middle part that lies between these two extremes is not only difficult to find, it is impossible to find. Walter Benjamin, another scholar, thinks that the task of the translator is to use the translator's own language to release pure language from the spell of another language, to liberate the language imprisoned in a text through the act of recreation. Translation as recreation. You have to liberate the language of the source language text when you are talking about a target audience. For the sake of pure language, the translator breaks through the many decaying obstructions in his own language. So translator is to give up certain things to achieve some sort of purity in the translators. Scholars very often insinuate, their own political predilection, subjective preference, choices for definite reasons, and make problematic the enormous divide which exists between the audience in the source text with the intended audience. If you are talking about the translations of Shakespeare's text, for example, every year new translations are coming out, and political, predilections of the translator, the ideological bias of the translator, the culture of this target language audience, all very often come out when we are translating texts like, for example, The Tempest or The Merchant of Venice or Hamlet or Henry IV or Henry V. So the English word translation comes from the word Latin translatio. When you are talking about the origin, translatio, translates as across, while ferre means to carry or to bring. Latio derives from letters, the past participle of ferre. Taking this meaning together, our contemporary definition of translation, that's why is carrying across. Bringing across, in this context, we are referring to the text only, and so every act of translation can be actually mingled with some problems and challenges. Every act, any translation, there are challenges, there are problems, there are possibilities. Poetry translation sometimes may be more challenging than other types of translation due to the importance of both form and content in the type of interpretation and response evoked in the audience. In poetry translation, one of the most essential issues to be addressed by the translator is whether to prefer the form to the content or vice versa. Whether if you are translating a sonnet, is it possible for you to, keep to the 14-line format, or whether it is possible to keep to the Petrarchan mold or the Shakespearean mold, that is to be decided. And the first problem one encounters in attempting to translate poetry is the importance of both its meaning and form in the response created by it in the audience. And the translators should make decision whether to sacrifice the form for the meaning or vice versa. So there will be always this conflict between the form and the content. Poetry is a means of expressing one nation's feeling and attitude, and translation acts as a bridging tool. Translator as a person who will be helping you in crossing over. That is to be taken into account. And discussion about the concepts of translatability, that's why, whether which are translatable, which cannot be translated, that is a sort of perennial problem. And one of the prominent scholars, has elaborated on the concept of untranslatability. He distinguishes two types of untranslatability, which he terms as linguistic and cultural. On the linguistic level, untranslatability occurs when there is no lexical, syntactical substitute in the target language for a source language term. Because we are translating cultures, so we have to carefully look into account whether it is possible and whether if it is not possible. For example, the Odia recreation, transcreation of T.S. Eliot's Westland. Because T.S. Eliot was writing in a cold country, and Guru Prasad Mahanti was translating from a tropical country. So the first question was, April, he wanted to, because he was writing for a target audience, the Orias, he says April will be equivalent to our rainy season. So instead of say April is the coolest month, he translated Varsa Ritu Nistura Nirbama. He finds a set of equivalence. And lilacs flowers may be very popular, but here perhaps the target language people may not be too very familiar. He says Ranganiful. Change the name of the flower. You know, sometimes you have to make compromises, but as I said, whether you have to adhere strictly to the target language or to the source language, that is to be taken into account. And this is very much said by Anton Popovic again, distinguishing two types. You know, first is defined as a situation in which linguistic elements of the original cannot be replaced adequately in structural, linear, functional, or semantic way. And second type goes beyond the purely linguistic, a situation where the relation of expressing the meaning, the relation between the creative subject and its linguistic expression in the original doesn't find an adequate linguistic expression in the translation. So that is again to be taken into account, and that is why the question remains. This is where, should we retain the literal meaning of the original text or only the sense of it? Translators must decide this. Whether you are to go, if it is possible to get a meaning of, get a literal translation, then how much we are sacrificing and how much we are adding. And that is to be decided. Should a put piece of translation read like an original work, or we should always have the feel that it is an original work? Should translation read like an original text, or it should read like a translation? Should fidelity to the original be considered the core principle of translation? Should, because in the past, translators had been, sentenced to death because they were not following this particular dictum. Should translation reflect the style of the original source language? Or should the translator intervene to express his or her own style? That is to be taken into account. Should translation be a reflection of the time in which the original piece was written? Should translation be a reflection of the time in which the original piece was written? Or it should reflect the time in which it is translated? That is again, because if you are translating Shakespeare, Chaucer, for example, should you retain the Middle English format and you are translating Chaucer into Oriya? Should you, write in a language that is not understood by our modern readers? Chaucer is difficult. When we read even now, because we are not so adept with Middle English. So this is a decision, because if you are writing Chaucer in the same arcane, Odia of 19th century, then it may be difficult for the target reader. There is no point, because the translator should try to communicate also. The target audience should be very much satisfied. If you are translating an old text with a different linguistic flavor, if you are not communicating, then there is no point of translating. Should the translator retain the rhyme or rhythm of the original or write it in prose? Or should he or she write it in prose, or the translator should follow the practice of the original? So the same question, whether to emphasize the target audience or the source audience. Argentinian poet, Jorge Luis Borges, learned simultaneously English and Spanish from the English father and Spanish mother, and later acquired French, German, Latin, and Italian. And later he became the author of the source text and the destination text, often insisting on adding elements which were not there in the original. Borges is some sort of an exception who will be telling always that every act of translation is a creation also. So if you are even when you are translating this same text, each act of translating the same text will be an act of creation. Each act of translation will be a set of creation. So that is Dryden, English poet, is also very open, but he insisted that you must maintain the character of his original and not make him unlike himself. Try to have the essence of the original text and don't be too very much like himself, unlike himself. But to this end, he is prepared to allow a translator far greater freedom that he had in 1680, when he was translating Virgil, for example. So, Dryden is, you must maintain the essence of the original text, and you must have, you can take a little bit of freedom, to reach your target audience. Another translator, Shelley, so Dryden's question was very clear. What kind of knowledge and experience, scholarly, artistic, human, are required of a translator? What degree or kind of fidelity to the original should be seek? How should he best preserve the original's distinctive character and spirit? Should he follow his author in his vices as well as his virtues? It is like should the translator edit the text first, then translate? How might he best make the unfamiliar manners, customs, and beliefs contained in his source text accessible to a modern audience? It is like, should he try to first delete some of the things which are not familiar, which may not be too very familiar to a target language audience? Shelley, another critic, 19th century poet, in his defense of poetry, this is what he says, very conservative in a way. Hence the vanity of translation. It was as wise to cast a violet into a crucible that you might discover the formal principles of its color and order, as seek to transfuse from one language into another the creation of a poet. The plant must spring again from its seed, or it will bear no flower. And this is the burden of the curse of Babel. Because you cannot get the color of violet, you cannot get the, the beauty of it, the flavor, the color, the beauty, all these things will be very difficult when you are trying to transplant it into a different culture and different language. So do we consider the curse of Babel to be insurmountable? And are translations merely violets in a crucible? We take note of Shelley's formulation. Perhaps Shelley implies that translation is impossible. Of course, but because there is no such thing as a perfect translation, on the other hand, translators are in a way cultural mediators. This is to be remembered, cultural mediators. Rainer Maria Rilke, another poet, on the 15th February 1914, he inscribed a poem in the copy of his Juno Elisis and said to his Polish translator, this is what he said: happy are those who know behind all words the unsayable stands. Behind all words the unsayable stands, and from that source alone the infinite crosses over to the gladness and to us. So there is certain things which cannot be sayable. The unsayable is there. There is always the shadow between intention and execution, between promise and performance, between what you intend to say and what you say it. So we have to accept it. Certain words with their associative memories cannot be transplanted and cannot be conveyed in a different language. So we have to think about that. Happier. In this poem, Rilke says that translators should just work with the spirit of the poem without being hung up with a literal word for word translation. Don't be very much hung up with the fidelity to the original. You should rather try to capture the essence. So be it Dryden, be it Rilke, be it Humboldt, be it Tagore, everybody is saying this. Some translators would exercise extreme caution sometimes and choose their words with meticulous care when translating them, lest they distort the original and thereby come under criticism, or in certain situations be punished by law. Examples are there. You know, when you are talking about, for example, the Bible translations in the past, translations from religious texts, we know, translators had been, put to gallows because of that. Sometimes translators should exercise because of that. A good translation should not read like a translation because the original certainly doesn't read like a translation. So for a translation not to read like a translation, the translator must use extreme domestication, creating a transparent translation that keeps the reader from detecting the presence of the original. So whether it should read like a translation, should not read like a translation, for example, when Tagore was translating his own poems into English, he was not trying to talk in terms of the fidelity to his own original text. The original Bangla, the Gitanjali in original Bangla is very different, from the Gitanjali in English translation. Tagore sometimes will be changing, recreating. Sometimes he'll be taking two Bangla poems and make it one poem. If you go through the original Bangla of Gitanjali, and if you go through the translation of Gitanjali in English into English, you shall see that Tagore has never followed this dictum of this fidelity to the original. He was trying to recreate, rather following Borges' example, each is a set of recreation. But such transparent or nationalized translations obscure much of the background information on which the processes of both translation and reading display, and eliminate the linguistic and cultural differences between translators from different foreign languages. Naturalized translations rely on the easily understood language of the cultural mainstream and inevitably reflect the values, beliefs, and cultural modes embodied by the target language, thus forcing the source language into an aligned ideological territory. Knowing fully well, Tagore's translations come into mind. Even when Tagore is translating Kabir, when he translated, even critics point out that if Tagore would not have said that he was translating Kabir, nobody would have known. Even one critic, Professor Chaudhary, Shukam Chaudhary, went to the extent of telling that sometimes the poem should be having only 25%, 35% of the original Kabir. So it is always a sort of difficult thing to negotiate whether translations should be sometimes be taken as recreation, transcreation, interpretation. So during the process of rewriting, strategies emphasizing fluency, perform an acculturation function, domesticating a foreign text so that not only does the reader clearly understand its meaning, but it is able to gratify his or her own artistic impulses upon discovering his or her own culture reflected in a foreign one. Sometimes we try to impose, try to interpret our own culture in the light of, what we are translating, from a foreign text. So Venuti was another well-known critic when he was writing about rethinking translation. So that is to be, kept in mind. You know, it should actually, even in films, it happens. If you have seen different versions of Hamlet, for example, there is a version when Mel Gibson is playing Hamlet. There is a version where Laurence Olivier is playing Hamlet. There is a version where Ben Kingsley is playing Hamlet. So, Mad Max, I was reading a review. Mad Max plays Hamlet. You know, Mel Gibson's Hamlet is very much different from Laurence Olivier's. Even the way they will be, holding this sword, when they will be encountering the ghost. So it is always, you are trying to interpret, the time in which you are living. So we can again point out that the concept of translators as cultural mediators takes on a greater significance in the Indian context, as frequently translation or lack of translation could become a question of the life or death of a culture itself. For what is language but the vehicle of a living culture? And if a culture remains locked in a linguistically closed space where no cross-fertilization may occur, it runs into the risks of becoming moribund. So when you are talking about the Indian context, and more still, when you are talking of India as a text, we know how the Westerners, how the Britishers had interpreted India. Like you are talking about the literary aspects of translation. If the text is India, it is not a fixed, confined entity, but a continuous tradition of rewrites, spanning a period from the Middle Ages to the modern times, passing through the hands of the Mughals, the English, and many more. And the way English had translated India, the India was the land of the fakirs, land of the sadhus, gurus, godmen. It is the land of the uncouth barbarians. Remember Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Boredom? English people came to India to civilize the Indians. Because we are not civilized. With all our rich cultural heritage, with all our Vedas and Upanishads, with all our heritage, we were never civilized. They came to civilize. They came with the light of civilization. That was one way of thinking about colonial translation. And the way they claim they represented India, but they only reflected their own ideas, their own hegemonic ideas, imperial ideas, very much masters of colonial reason. They wanted to, put pressure and interpret India the way they wanted to do that. For example, James Mill, father of well-known political philosopher John Stuart Mill, wrote a two-volume history of British India. He never came to India. When you are trying to translate an idea, translate the ideas of a country, translate the people's, translate the country that is a repository of all the best that has been there, you have the audacity to say that it is not necessary on your part to visit India to write about India. He had a two-volume history of British India, James Mill. So they claimed that, and they followed all this. Sometimes they will be following the magisterial way of looking at India, that we are the masters, you are the servants, we are the hegemonic, representatives of a race, and you are very much the subservient creatures. Sometimes they will be talking about the curatorial exports. You go to British Museum, you go to British Library and read about India without coming to India. And India is very much like a museum piece. People are very much like pawns. They can be handled the way they wanted to. So like pawns or like museum pieces so you are taking a sort of curatorial approach, exoticist approach. Without coming, like India is a pack of say postcard pictures. I had been to India, I had seen India, I had been to Kulu Malani, I had been to Bundavan Garden, I had been to Taj Mahal, I had seen this, and you'll be giving such a picture without trying to think in terms of a human empathetic approach. The India is people. The India is a, conglomeration, of places, cultures, people coming from different cultures. You never bother that. So that is very often to be taken. So that happens also in the case of literate text. If you are taking a magisterial stand, I'll be translating the text of an Oriya writer. Oh, my language is supreme, and Oriya is very much the target language, and it is not to be given the prominence. So the dialogue never takes place. Translator should be like a set of dialogue. William Jones, one of the earliest and greatest translators of Oriental literature into European languages, Jones, through his translation, Kalidas Misra, changed the cultural map of Europe forever and suggested that the Orient had treasures equal to its own. William Jones did a great service, but then, if you look at Abhigana Sakuntalam, he said that for the first time this play is being exposed to the readers in the West, and he took the liberty of deleting certain scenes, which he thought that were not very much in good spirit. So he deleted all this. So William Jones introduced, the Oriental literature to the West, but he also took the trouble, or sometimes, critics may differ, when you are trying to analyze whether a word for word, whether the certain scenes should be deleted, whether you presume that these scenes can well do harm. So that's to be taken into account. So could translations then be considered magic keys, unlocking doors to other culture? Yes. It unlocks very often, opens, unlocks, gives in. After all, translating is less a question of finding the right words than finding the right comparative cultural reference, which allow a text to be permeable in another time, in another place. So that is to be taken into account if you are talking in terms of translation. And and translation must be fluent or almost fluent in their source language. That's why translators must be very much efficient and must know the source language well and must understand the target language also. And it is always a sort of never-ending process. And there is always this particular critic, Peter Newmark. He said there are so many, variations, changes, just for the sake of reference. And there may be word-for-word translation, literal translation, faithful translation, semantic translation, adaptation, free translation, idiomatic translation, communicative translation. So for whom you are doing, who are the target audience, who are the people? So these questions do come, whether you are to retain the original or whether you are to take care of the only target language practices. That is to be taken into account when you think, because translation is not a sort of simple exercise. It is a risky exercise, and sometimes it is very much a painful thing if you are trying to sacrifice one for the other. You gain something, you lose something. But that doesn't mean that changing images, it is always a dangerous procedure. And translators do not have the right to second guess the text. You don't have the right, because of your bad translation, let the author of a source language be not defamed. Changing an event to make it familiar is tampering with the text in an unseemly way. what right, how far we can go to temper a particular text. All images carry several metaphoric meanings that may or may not correspond to authorial intentions. A translator must be humble and not attempt to flatten cultural references in a mistaken attempt at uniformity and familiarity. So universality is emphatically not uniformity. So problems, I am suggesting so many variations. The plurality of a literary work as it moves across several networks would therefore seem to be a given in current translation theory insofar as such theory is relevant to literary translation. Plurality. There cannot be one singular way of translating a text. It is a plurality of voices, references. We cannot say that this is the only way to translate. This is how we can carry on. It is not possible. And sometimes, earlier translators, were not given this at the prominence. But nowadays, when you are translating text, sometimes we do believe that collaborative translation is very much a sort of new thing, like we can say. It is not always the writer and the translator. Sometimes it is the writer and translators. Instead of in translation, it is an open-ended series, and literary translation sometimes, by extension, a very invention of translation should be seen as a collaborative aesthetic phenomenon, collaborative venture. I remember when we were translating Bhima Bhoi, 19th century, Odia's saint poet, tribal poet. We have 6 translators. And there will be discussions. Even what first draft was prepared by myself and there was another scholar. But then when we sat together, 6 of us, each one will be bringing in the feedback. We'll be taking consultations from each and every translator. And we'll be trying to come out with a reliable text. When Fakir Mohan is translated, for example, by, Fakir Mohan's Chamar Artagunta was translated by Professor Ravi Shankar Misra, Professor Jatendra Naik, Professor Paul Sempre, Professor Satyaprakash Mohan, the 4 translators. Earlier, actually, Kamalakant Mahapatra, Mr. Kamalakant Mahapatra, Mrs. Lilavati Mahapatra, they had translated Fakir Mohan and Bhattu Light. That collaborated. So, it's not always one translator. But whatever it is, translation is very much a sort of creative exercise. When you are translating, you are creatively engaged and you are very much bringing in something new. And as I said in the beginning, it opens doors. It is a sort of exercise that brings in fresh air to a creative text. So thank you very much.
Kalidas, it was a wonderful deliberation actually. I think translation as such is, I agree with you, it's not a simple venture. Naturally, you got to take care of so many factors, and that way it probably becomes challenging and interesting. And the translator knows what his intention is and what really he wants to achieve. So that probably sometimes kind of guides the very mode of translation. I just want to raise one issue and would like to hear from you, like we used to discuss so many things when we were together. I would refer to Jhumpa Lahiri. And let me go back to Beckett. Well, these people didn't, their originals, as we got it, were written in French. I mean, Jhumpa Lahiri wrote in Whereabouts, let's say, and the other novel was she went to Rome and stayed there and wrote that in Latin. So, what problems the translator of Beckett and Jhumpa Lahiri, well, whereabouts I think she translated it. So, could we just kind of guess that and include, like what you said, and it might be interesting. I would like to have your response.
Yeah, Jhumpa Lahiri is very much, when she decided to write it in Italian.
Italian, yes.
Yeah, again, Italian is one of our acquired languages.
Yep.
And from Italian, again, she is trying to translate it into English.
Into English.
And Jhumpa Lahiri says it in some of our interviews that every time she tries to write, she tries to create. She doesn't, translation is a sort of creative exercise, engagingly creative exercise.
Yes, that's right.
Jhumpa Lahiri doesn't believe in this extreme fidelity to an original text. Even like, I think Jhumpa Lahiri has some sort of affinity with Borges.
Yeah, good.
So far as the translation exercise is concerned,
That's right.
Borges allows the translator to recreate. And each act of translation is an act of creation.
Act of recreation, yes.
So that way, I think Jhumpa Lahiri has very much followed a tradition that believes in giving freedom to the translator in recreating. But yes, as everybody knows, freedom should not be taken as a sort of license.
The kind of license, yeah.
It should be very much
naturally,
bringing in the best of the source language text. So
yes.
That is how I can say. Thank you, Mrs. Sir, for your.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. You have touched upon many aspects of literary translation. Starting from John Dryden, then Shelley, and coming to translation studies scholar like Lawrence Venuti, Peter Newmark. You have given actually a consolidated thing actually for our participants. And they can generate. They can learn a lot from them. The more they will read and the more they will do research, the more they will learn from it. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you.